Not excited to be joined by a very special guest from a very special place. It is Peter Burns. PB, you got to set the scene for the audio only crowd of where you are right now because you're not the first international guest that we have had. But this is rare form to be able to get you in this setting.
So I'm down in the Bahamas with one Christopher Doring, who it's funny. It's like watching Saban prowl the sidelines of an SEC championship game. To see Chris Doring in his element here in the Bahamas. We've talked about this, Connor, for like years. That hey, me and CD doing SEC this morning. We had to go on like a guys trip once, and finally we have made that thing a reality. And I'm like, seriously, it is interesting to see the man who is like the mayor, the unofficial mayor of the Atlantis resort down here, Doring. Like I'm in awe. It's like what Kirby is doing to recruiting is what Doring does down here at the Bahamas. It's fascinating to watch.
No shoes, no shirt, no service does not apply to one Chris Doring in the Bahamas.
Oh,
And
the
I can
shirt was off. Like the shirt was off legitimately 30 seconds after we got here to the location. And I'm like, my man, I appreciate it. You're 62 years old and you look like you could go play right now. I'd recruit Chris Doring on my NCAA video game. We'll put it that way right now.
62, he's 50. He just turned 50. He's 62.
No, 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 no. Don't give him credit. I think he's at least 52. So let's not give him too much credit.
All
Right
right,
there. Wait, who was
fair.
the other international guest? Was it George Somerville
Of
that you
course, it was
did?
George Somerville. Yeah, obviously that one just made all the sense in the world to be able to have him on because like seeing Sankey shout him out to start off wasn't. And
Yeah.
I got in touch with and saw George pretty much every day at SEC Media Days and like talked to the Feinbaum people. And was like, Danny, like you need to get him on. He's like the perfect late week person to have on. George is the best, so he is technically more international than you.
Yeah. Yeah, and he's got the cool accent as well too. But
Yeah.
it is, it's one of those things too. It goes to show you, like when you're there last week and we're there last week about like I watched all the other media days that are happening, and you realize like I know we just say it just means more, but like just the way that event every single year, and I think it felt different with Texas and Oklahoma coming this year, where it felt even bigger than it's ever been before.
Okay, PB. So let's along those lines. Last week I gassed you up by saying I don't think enough people are talking about how you're going full Doring and becoming like kind of jacked, and I've definitely noticed. So let's stick with storylines today that aren't getting enough talk. We just got through SEC Media Days. We now have a pretty good idea of what's being talked about, what's not being talked about. That's all I want to talk about with you. That's a very open-ended thing to discuss today, but I feel like there are a lot of things that aren't necessarily being talked about enough. Bobby Petrino coming back to Arkansas, talking about Kirby
Yeah,
Smart and this schedule that is an absolute gauntlet that Georgia has. That if it were anybody else,
totally.
we'd be talking about as one of the two most difficult schedules in all of college football. But what's the thing that you've noticed that you feel like coming away from media days that people aren't talking about enough that we should be giving more love to during talking season?
Yeah, I think just kind of that middle tier of the about how different we talk about these teams when it's East and West, right? Like, we talked a lot about Kentucky or who's going to be the second best team in the East or second best team in the West or whatnot. And I don't feel like we had those conversations this year. So, I felt like we didn't talk any about the Wildcats. I felt like we talked nothing about Mississippi State. Like, I think, Jeff Levy over at Mississippi State, I think is a fascinating conversation because it reminds me a lot of 2020 Ole Miss, kind of where it's like, hey, the defense may not be great, the team may not be great, but I think they're going to be fun as hell. And Levy was the architect of that offense. So I did notice adding Texas takes a lot of the oxygen out of the room to not only Oklahoma but to A&M. I mean, think about it. This is first year under Mike Elko, no Jimbo Fisher. Like the schedule is there. Like, and I don't even know how many times we talked about A&M as an actual team versus oh, I can't wait for Texas to go to A&M. So I think there's that middle tier that kind of falls by the wayside on media days when we have 16 teams in the conference.
I think it's refreshing not to be talking about A&M as much because I think A&M fans even
Yeah.
don't mind it. I truly think that they are embracing having a year like this where it's not about Jimbo Fisher and the buyout. It's not massive expectations coming in. And yeah, massive expectations, that's good. You'd probably rather have those than not. But I do think A&M fans are kind of looking at this going like, actually, this isn't that bad. Is it annoying that everybody's talking about Texas? Yes. But maybe that's the thing that we should be talking about more is the fact that this great rivalry is coming back. But then you see, I just did the thing where I just made it about Texas.
No, but I mean, and again, I think if you look at the two coaches that are coming in that are most, um, you know, that are not going to be talked about enough is going to be Brent Venables in Oklahoma and Mike Elko at A&M. And I think both of those guys, Connor, as you pointed out before, those guys like to play they're not the wallflowers, but they don't need to be at every single headline. Like they're football coaches that don't want to have to deal with the BS that goes on with it. So it actually comes at a perfect time. And you start looking at Oklahoma, which is, I think, a very interesting story because this is a 10-win team last year. So you don't know, and they beat Texas 8 of the last 10 seasons, which is crazy about. So I don't know. I'm probably more jazzed about this upcoming season than I have been about a season in probably the last. I mean, since I started, working for the SEC Network for sure.
Are we talking about Kentucky leading the SEC rather in Bill Connolly's percentage of returning production? Are we talking about that enough, or are we talking about that maybe not enough because this is very often the time when it feels like Mark Stoops is going to kind of pull a fast one and do the Youngstown thing?
Yeah, which is like, hey, you don't respect me, I'm going to beat your ass in a dark alley. Like that's what Kentucky traditionally does. I don't know. Like I go back and forth about like returning starters and returning production because I once had a coach who's no longer in this conference who once told me, I won't name names, but I said, man, you guys got like 9 returning starters on defense. Like you got to feel good about your defense. And he's like, just because they're returning doesn't mean they were worth a shit. and, and I was like, what a great line. And I forever have rethought about for the production. And when I look at Phil Steele's, like, oh my God, look at how much this production is, or Bill Connolly's got these numbers. Like, just because they're back doesn't mean that they were great, right? So I think that's why I'm fascinated, not only for the 12-team playoff at Texas Oklahoma, but like, what about these teams that are transfer teams? And Ole Miss being that litmus test. Like, can you put together I wouldn't call them a team of mercenaries, but they kind of are. And because I don't think it worked well for A&M and Jimbo when Jimbo was trying to win the #1 recruiting class against Saban. But for whatever reason, it feels like it could work with Lane because I feel like it's more of a mindset of like, this is transactional. Like, you're here, I want you here. I don't know what your future is, but damn sure if we're not going to win together. So I think that's why I'm really interested in Ole Miss in that year of like, it's a bigger story than just the SEC. It's a story about all of college football of, can you quote unquote recruit a transfer portal playoff bid, or do you have to build the culture around your program and add 1 or 2 guys?
I don't know. I think Mike Norvell has kind of already proven that you can do that. And I think the job that he did
Yeah,
at Florida State last year, to me, even though they didn't get into the playoffs, still going 13-0 with that roster and the way that they plugged in pieces, all the draft picks that came from the portal. I kind of think Norvell has already shown that you can do that. It's just not necessarily going to work for everybody. And it's going to be interesting to see that way that it plays out. You are repping the Penny Lane shirt right now, which is an SDS original. That was with, I think we did a deal with Breaking Tea in like 2020, I remember, and those shirts
yeah.
came out and they sold like hotcakes. I remember. Could you imagine having these conversations about Lane back then, back like 2020, going into all this stuff like before everything, and thinking that he's going into year 5 at Ole Miss, and there are people saying Ole Miss can be a semifinal type good, and maybe who knows, like everybody's kind of favorite dark horse for a national championship.
Yeah, I think we could, and I think that was why it was intriguing when he went there. I think the question was whether or not Lane was going to use this as a catapult to a different program, or if he was going to be true to stay at the SIP. And I think now that's why this year is so big for him to be like, all right, like, can I showcase? Because can I showcase all the money that we spend in their collective and NIL? Does it actually equal success? Because if it is, then I think those same boosters step up because they love it. But what happens in a lot of places is everybody's going to step up for the first year or two at collectives. What happens if you don't get a return? What if all of a sudden the guy at NC State who's giving money to their collective says, "Hey man, we went 8-4," or I paid a bunch of money to a recruit via the collective, and then it doesn't work well, then they transferred out. Are they going to be like, well, I'm never going to give money to this, program again? Like, that's why this is all kind of a pilot program to see what college football is like right now. And I think I look at Drink has done a great job of it. Where in the fact of I think he's built a program, he's recruited really well, but at the same time that they have used their collective and be like, let's be smart about what we do. I think college football teams now are going to be more like NFL teams where it's like, how are we smart with the money that we spend in good quote unquote free agency versus just blindly spending like the New York Mets do and that they don't have any success.
Dang, shots fired at the Mets. Look, they're always getting strays.
Yeah,
That's
they're
rivalry.
out taking strays. I'm here in the Bahamas. They're taking strays out here. By the
Jeez.
way, on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is my connection here at the pool? Like, is it like
No, it's not that bad.
decent?
No, it's actually
Okay,
like
good.
pretty. I'll give it like a 7 or something like that, which
That's all. That's
I've had worse. We've had like a couple, like 2 or 3 second pauses, and people don't give us a 1-star review for that. But no, we're working through it. We're perfectly fine. I'll get you out of here with this last one because it's something that I've been thinking about a lot. Like, are we not talking enough about the year 2 Hugh Freeze arc and how this has typically been when he has figured things out? I realize teams have to lose, and Auburn's going to be one of those teams that's going to lose some of these tough games. Maybe they lose that game early on against Oklahoma, and that makes people say Oklahoma is for real in the SEC, whatever the case may be. But the combination of Jordan Hare Magic with what they did last year in a weird year 1 with Hugh Freeze's history of figuring his roster out in year 2, is that something that we are not talking about enough in the SEC?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest with you. This is why I don't like doing this podcast because every single thing I think of, and like either you tweeted first or I tweeted, we're like the Spider-Man meme talking about each other. Because I left this week and I'm like, you start looking at Auburn's schedule and you're like, they could win a lot of games. And I saw Hugh and Hugh seemed oddly confident. Like the only thing that I had an issue with is like, all right, Peyton Thorne, is he the dude? Like, you get a chance to meet these quarterbacks down there, and I was blown away with Quinn Ewers. I really like Jackson Dart, and I like Peyton Thorne, but also Peyton Thorne looked like a Miami nightclub promoter, and I'm
Yeah.
like, man, am I gonna like? It's just who he is. Like, and it was fine. Like is that the guy? I don't know. I think that's fascinating. But to your point of Hugh Freeze in year 2, or Bobby Petrino at going back to Arkansas, or Brock Vandergriff going out to Georgia, where we don't really even talk about him. Like, how many of these storylines get washed away because it's about Texas and Oklahoma, or Kalen DeBoer taking over Alabama, or I will tell you this: I don't think we talk any about Georgia because I think
Yeah.
honestly at media days, Georgia's like the IRS of the SEC, where we're just like, all right, we know that they're going to be great, whatever. Like, that's fine. We'll see him in the playoff. Like, no one's talked about Kirby Smart. Like, Kirby Smart has lived like the most charmed life because he operated and had success under the shadow of Nick Saban. And then now with the 12-team playoff in Texas, Oklahoma, he can still operate under that same shadow. So I'm just fascinated about the whole situation coming up.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I do think it's going to be a fascinating year. There's 16 teams. You can only get to so many of them. Apologies, by the way, if you can hear my daughter just hysterical.
I can't hear anything. There's like Pitbull in the background. Doring's yelling at me because my margarita's ready.
Oh gosh.
Like,
All right, get the margarita. That was going to be the last thing I was going to ask you was what's
no, so I
the
gotta.
drink?
I'll come up. I'll come up with the last thing. We might lose it. So he's probably playing like $500 a hand black right now. But I just want the list of viewers to be able to go see here what it looks like whenever I see my man that's just shirtless on the podcast. Look at that. He's doing
Unreal.
Look at that.
Unreal.
Like the man with like those nipples don't. I mean, I got nice small nipples. He's got nice small nipples. I'll be honest. So
We're gonna blur that for the YouTube
Cheers.
audience. Cheers, gentlemen. Enjoy the trip. Safe travels.
See you, buddy.
Take care.